Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be talking to you, Professor Robert Zaretsky, about your brilliant new book, The Subversive Simone Weil, which actually today was heralded by the Los Angeles Review of Books as I was not sorry. I'll start again. Thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be talking to you, Professor Robert Zaretsky, about your brilliant new book, The Subversive Simone Weil, which was heralded today by the Los Angeles Review of Books as written in elegant and accessible prose, a timely volume that speaks obliquely about the many trials Americans have endured in recent years and will continue to endure. And I think what you do very well in the book is describe not just the kind of difficulties and inconsistencies of her thought, but why it's relevant today. So I would say if you have not yet bought the book, then you should go and get it. And so I think it would be brilliant as a starter to know more about her life, because I mean, it was extraordinary. And I suppose also why she is subversive. Why did you choose that adjective?
Well, first, my thanks to you, Lottie, for joining the conversation with me on the subject of Simone Weil. And my thanks to Anthony Morgan for the invitation. And my thanks to the many people out there who are taking an hour out of their lives to listen in, and I hope join the conversation as well. Simone Weil's life was as short as it was meaningful. She was born in 1908. She died in 1943. And it's a life that spanned nearly 2 world wars, as well as a civil war, the Spanish Civil War. And it was a war that was deeply impacted by these conflicts. And in various ways, Simone Weil participated in all of these wars. I can say more about that in a moment. She was thoroughly Parisian. Her father and her mother, the mother came from the diaspora, from Russian, Lithuanian stock, and the father's family was Alsatian, though originally East European. They were both Jewish, but they were fiercely secular. Judaism was not practiced in the household. It was simply an identity, one that they did not use for themselves. And this is important to keep in mind when we think, as many people do when Simone Weil comes to mind, about her strident thoughts and opinions on Judaism. She and her older brother were both prodigies. And they were, in a way, cultivated as prodigies, not so much by the father, but by the mother. They went to the very best schools. In the case of Simone Weil, she went to perhaps the most famous high school, lycée in France, Henri IV in Paris. And then in 1928, having graduated from Henri IV, she became the only woman to enter in 1928 the École Normale Supérieure, which is the grandest of the grandes écoles, the great schools, which is basically a parallel system of education in France, of higher education. And it's after her time at the École Normale Supérieure that she took a series of teaching positions in small cities in France. And she did that for 4 years. Each year it was a different city, Bourges, Auxerre, Le Puy, and so on. And then after those 4 years of teaching, she decided that teaching was not really allowing her to connect with life, the lives of others. And so she basically put that aside. And for a year between 1933 and 1934, she worked in a series of factories in Paris. She wanted to know what it meant to be a worker, what the working life was like. She did that for a year, and it's something we should talk about at greater length, Lottie, if you want, later on. And then following the experience at the factories in Paris, the next great event in her life was, of course, the Spanish Civil War. Not unlike George Orwell, in so many, in fact, in so many ways, their lives parallel one to the other. Like Orwell, she decides, though she's a pacifist, that she cannot sit this out. And she goes to Spain, she signs on, or she actually sneaks into a military column that is basically staffed by anarchists, the political party to which she felt closest. She saw a few days of combat, but then she was extremely myopic. One day she took her glasses off, stepped into a large pot of boiling oil. She scalded her leg and she was shipped out. And her parents imposed themselves upon her. They came down, learning upon this, and they brought her back to Paris for a convalescence. And during those late years in the 1930s, Simone Weils' worldview begins to turn away from politics, Lottie, and begins to turn towards religion, in particular Christianity, in particular Catholicism. And as she's making this pivot from the political to, I guess we can call the theological, there's yet another world war, the Second World War. Like millions of other Parisians, she and her parents were caught up in what the French call l'exode, the Great Exodus. Millions of Parisians, of people from northern France, from southern Belgium, surging onto the roads, trying to get their way towards the south of France, towards the sea, in order to escape the German army that's advancing on France and advancing on Paris. And for the next several months, they find themselves in Marseille. And it's in Marseille that Simone Weil makes contact with a resistance organization. And at the very same time, she makes contact with a remarkable individual by the name of Joseph-Marie Patron, who was a Dominican priest. And she wanted to speak to Patron because she was thinking about converting to Catholicism. And they held a series of conversations about Catholicism. And it was to Patron that she confided a number of letters that, as well as a couple of essays that she gave to him, that Patron, after the war, published and constitute one of her earliest published books and one of her bestsellers, known as a spiritual autobiography. At the very same time, through Patron, she meets Gustave Thibon, who is a farmer, is a largely self-learned theologian and classicist. And he's also a member of the Action Française, an extreme right-wing organization that was virulently, and remains to this very day, it still exists, its vestiges, virulently anti-Semitic, as was Thibon. And Thibon knew that Simone Weil was Jewish, but yet Weil persuades Thibon to take her on as a farmhand, and he lives on his farm. She helps with the chores, and when they're not working, she schools him in Greek, and he talks to her about his religious views. When she leaves Marseille with her parents to go to New York via South America, via Portugal, she leaves all of her notebooks with him. And it's those notebooks that after the war are published in fact, are edited in important ways by Thibon. And it's that book, Gravity and Grace, that also, along with a spiritual autobiography, defines Simone Weil for not just the French, but for the Anglo-American readership for the next 30 years, by and large. It's only over those 30 years that the other works by which we now know her begin to be read and begin to be known. Most importantly, The Need for Roots, but so many others. And those works were published posthumously because after she arrives in New York with her parents and sees them safely settled, she moves heaven and earth in order to return to France. She thinks that this is her place, to be in France, combating, resisting the Nazi occupation. She manages to persuade an old friend from the École Normale Supérieure to pull strings that allows her to join de Gaulle's Free French movement based in London. She's brought there as an analyst. And it's during the last months of her life, between late 1942 and early 1943, that she writes several hundred pages of what we would call policy papers that constitute the bulk of her writing. And these works made their way right after the war to, of all people, Albert Camus, the author of The Stranger, and in 1947, the author of The Plague. It's while he's putting the finishing touches to The Plague that Camus becomes aware of Simone Weil, and he's blown away by Weil's writings. And as an editor at Gallimard, the most prestigious French publishing house, Camus is responsible for the publication of several of Weil's works. And what's interesting for anybody who has read Camus, it's certainly interesting for me, given my own books on Albert Camus, is how dramatic the impact of Weil's writings were on Camus' thought and writings, and help account for this dramatic shift between the Camus of what we call the cycle of the absurd, his earliest works, The Strange and the Myth of Sisyphus, to the Camus of the cycle of rebellion, of revolt, which among other works includes his novel, The Plague, and his philosophical essay, The Rebel. But of course, Simone Weil would know nothing of this. In early 1943, convinced that nobody in the leadership of the Free French is paying her any mind at all, she quits. And shortly after quitting the Free French, a friend finds her collapsed in her room. She is wheeled off to the hospital. She's suffering from tuberculosis. And the tuberculosis is compounded by the fact that Weil will not eat more calories or consume more calories than those in France because of severe rationing were able to consume. And it is the confluence of her tuberculosis and just the wasting away of her body and her refusal to eat that leads to her death in the spring of 1943. And in fact, she's buried outside of that sanatorium, just outside of London. That's about as good a summary as I can offer.
That's incredibly comprehensive. I think what is really interesting is that when she died, the doctor, I think you maybe referenced this, said, she killed herself. This was, almost suicide, because she just would refuse to eat. And this insistence that her political ideals had to match up to her behavior, something in that is incredibly admirable. And you talk a lot in the book about how it's a really uncomfortable thing to read, you know, this kind of obsession with living this like pure kind of life of integrity. It's uncomfortable for lots of us to read because we don't feel that we meet those standards, but also there's a kind of recklessness to it because, you know, ultimately she goes and lives with these workers and she goes and becomes a worker or whatever, but she's a middle class girl from Paris that has the choice, and you say this, she has the choice to enter it and she also has the choice to leave it. And, you know, could you talk a bit more about the kind of, I suppose that she's not necessarily always that likable, and there's a really interesting encounter. There's an encounter with Simone de Beauvoir, which I think is just such a, I'd love you to just explain that, because it kind of, it goes into that, it kind of explores that a little bit more.
Yeah, you asked me why I chose the adjective subversive.
Sorry, yeah, of course I did.
Right, and that's more or less why I did. Whenever I read Simone Weil, and I have the impression, Lottie, this was the case for you as well, from the exchanges we had prior to today, you seem at one and the same time so attracted, but also so repelled by Weil, and the ways in which not so much she expresses her thought, but by the way in which she inhabits her thought. Mm. And this is what's so subversive, I find, about Simone Weil, because each and every time I read her, and I think this parallels your experience, I am subverted, if you will. In other words, I understand cognitively, intellectually, ethically, the case she is making. But at the very same time, I understand not just my limits, but the limits of the world in which I live to apply these ideals. And there's a wonderful distinction made by the German sociologist Max Weber between the ethics of responsibility and the ethics of conviction. And I think that might help shed some light on why Simone Weil is so disturbing, so subversive. Weber argued that there are certain individuals who practice the ethics of conviction. In other words, that they hold fast to certain ideals, and that on behalf of these ideals, they are willing to sacrifice not just their own lives, Lottie, but other lives as well, because it's the ideal that is all important. On the other hand, Weber says, there are those who practice the ethics of responsibility. Those who practice this kind of ethics look around and they cannot see the forest for the trees, but the trees in this case are our fellow human beings. And that is what always carries the day, the needs of those individuals we see day in and day out. And that if we focus exclusively on the ideals, we risk damaging not just our own life, but the lives of others. Now, what's critical in Weber's distinction between these two ethics, and what's often lost in discussions, I think, of Max Weber, is that he is explicit in his argument that both of these ethics are essential. The world cannot survive without both types. We need the Simone Weils, but we also need the Mother Teresas. This is sort of how I deal with this tension. I can't think of another word for it. Like you, I read Simone Weil, and like her friend and biographer, Simone Patron, who and I quote her somewhere in the book, I cannot think of Simone, she writes, without thinking less of myself. Well, yeah, I just joined that club when I started reading her. And in a way, that's a good and great thing, because I tend to think the world of myself, right? Who doesn't really, right? But what Weil succeeds in reminding us, and this is what so attracted Iris Murdoch to Weil's writings, is that she teaches us to, she reminds us of the importance of pushing to one side what Murdoch calls the fat, relentless ego, right? That it's really a task to come and to see the world as it is. It's really a task not to look at somebody from my privileged position. Instead, the true task is looking at myself from another's afflicted position, because at the very least, that will remind me that what I have is not part of my essential nature. Instead, what I have is simply a collection of accidents of fate. It could have been otherwise. And so you could say, and I know you're impatient with this aspect of Simone Weil, that her decision to work in factories with workers, knowing that she could always stop working, right? And this is something that also disturbed Auguste de Tuffe, that very bright factory owner who hired her in Paris for her first job. Is he's thinking, you can leave whenever you want. What is this all about? But they needed to know what it was like to see herself from the perspective of these workers. That, for her, is what philosophers ought to be doing, right? For her, it was all an issue, a matter of action, and it was a matter of practice. And I'm looking at the clock, it's 1:30, and I've just been ranting and rambling. And so I know you have other questions, so please, just say, Rob, shut up and let me talk, okay? No, this is a conversation.
I think I want to let you talk. I think that, I think I'd love to know more about this idea of seeing how paying attention, that's one of the chapters is attention. And you've kind of touched on this idea of seeing things as they are. But could you describe more this sort of idea of negative effort? I mean, the ideas are, I found, quite complex to understand and to grasp, but there's also similarities to what, I can find on my iPhone on an app called Mindfulness. There's similarities there, and I'd love you to explore a bit more about that. Talk a bit more about that.
Well, there are parallels between the mindfulness movements that we see sprouting, certainly in the United States. I imagine that's the case in the UK as well. But it's not so much mindfulness that Simone Weil seeks, it's mindlessness, I think, in a way, because mindfulness, from my own paltry efforts at meditation, is not so much about losing yourself, but about focusing on particular aspects to yourself or thinking about yourself. There's a kind of metacognition at work. But for Simone Weil, attention was really the work of truly losing yourself, of forgetting about yourself. That wonderful Greek saying inscribed, we're told, at the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself, which is the beginning for the Platonic dialogues. That's the start to Socrates. Though she was a very keen Platonist, they had no patience with this notion of knowing oneself. Okay, forget that, she would say. Instead, what we should practice is knowing the other. Okay, and this is what she understands by attention, is by somehow, and her term for it is decreate. And Iris Murdoch's term for it, taking a page from they, is unselfing, is sort of just doing our very best to marginalize, to squeeze into a corner our just bulimic, blinding selves, so that we could see the world, we could see others as they really are. And this seems to me all the more important in an age where, and I see it with my children, where one of the great epidemics is attention deficit disorder. This is, it's certainly something that plagues my family. I see it with my students at university, that we are no longer capable of paying attention. In fact, we are rewarded for not paying attention. And it is significant, of course, not nearly as significant as other plagues or epidemics like our current COVID-19 pandemic, but yet it's extremely serious. And I think that Weil's notion of attention, and not mindfulness, but attention, paying heed to others, is so extraordinarily important for our own day.
Mm. Do you think then she would not be on, if she was around today, would she be on social media, or would she be, there's something very sort of sanctimonious about her, and this idea of paying attention, I think it's admirable, but again, it's just not realistic. I mean, you could argue it's just not, I just can't do that. So, would she, I wonder whether she would be, cancelled. She'd be cancelled in today's society. Would anyone be wanting to really hear? Would she just be that annoying kind of millennial that's kind of,
Yeah, she's always already annoying, but it's good to be annoyed, not unlike her hero Socrates, right? We require these gadflies to shock us, to wake us up. And not gadflies, but really horseflies in Socrates' case. And, it's this tension that you keep returning to between the ideas and their impracticality. Perhaps the most striking instance in Weil's writings is the nurses' plan, one that she attempted to sell to Charles de Gaulle, namely that the Allies should train groups of nurses, female nurses, to parachute over an active battlefield in order to bring first aid to the wounded. De Gaulle was about halfway through his reading of the plan when he looked up at one of his subordinates and said, "Mais elle est folle," but she's crazy, okay? And the proposal is crazy, but if you read the entire proposal, Weil is crazy like a fox. She's onto something extraordinarily important. She argues that this is what we're confronting with the Nazis. We have this young generation willing to lose their lives, to sacrifice their lives on the altar of National Socialism, as insane an ideology as one can be. And she said, we have all of the manpower, we have all of these material resources, but what we lack is a similar ideal, but a good ideal to inspire our youth. And she said, this is what the nurse's plan is. It's not in order to bring succor to the dying. It's in order to die on behalf of this ideal. It's the willingness to sacrifice one's life. And you're right, it's beyond impractical. It's inhuman. But yet she is pointing to something very serious, right? There is the absence of this driving force, this motivation, this conviction, to go back to Weber, right? In order to overcome ourselves on behalf of others. I'm looking at the clock again, it's nearly 22, and I just wonder if that's where Anthony wanted to turn things over to questions, or you, Lottie, or should we just pursue the conversation?
I've got one small question I'd love to ask before we go on to the Q&A. Just this idea of her interaction with the war. Then she obviously, her life is sandwiched by tremendous conflict, and I'm interested in you would think she was a pacifist, and she is sort of a pacifist, but she's also really bizarrely practical in the way that she goes, well, actually, Nazism, you can't face that without a war. That's beyond this. And her ideas of the Gandhi, for example, it's only effective if it works. Non-violent protests, and just I suppose a few minutes on that would be great.
Yeah, well, she wasn't the only pacifist who by 1939 decided that pacifism wasn't an answer to totalitarianism. Her fanboy, Albert Camus, felt the very same way. Camus was a lifelong pacifist. And then in 1942, he writes in his journal, there's this remarkable passage after the publication of The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus, and he begins work on the play. And he writes his journal that would a philosopher be taken seriously if, having reached a certain point in his thought and having written about that, he realizes that everything he has written is wrong and he needs to start again. And this marked Camus' passage from pacifism to joining the resistance. He realized that this is what the situation demanded. And in 1939, 1940, in Letters to Friends, Simone Weil is writing the very same thing. She said, what I did not see earlier is criminal, right? I understand it now, and I'm afraid it's too late, at least for me.
Yeah. Fascinating, thank you. So I'll turn to questions, and we have Cassandra Thompson, who's asked, did Weil participate in the publishing of her works?
Sorry, say that again?
Did Weil participate in the publishing of her works?
Did who participate?
Weil, sorry, Weil.
Oh, I'm sorry, no, no, forgive me, Lottie. She published a number of articles, mostly in the anarchist press in the 1930s, La Vie Prolétarienne, for example. But as far as larger works, the only really notable one, or the one that we read today, and in fact, it was the work that introduced me to Simone Weil, was her essay on the Iliad, which is subtitled, or the Poem of Force. Now, this work was published in 1941, I believe, in the Free Zone by a French journal, and she had to publish it under a pseudonym because French Jews were not allowed to publish under the laws of Vichy France. And so these were the only works the occasional works that were published in the far left press, or the few works that she wrote anonymously in 4041 in Marseille that were published in her lifetime. She was not responsible for anything that was published. Her mother was in effect her literary executor. And it was through the family that the manuscripts found their way to Camus' desk at Gallimard.
Okay, that's interesting. And so this sort of, it was through family connection that yeah.
And so, and it's interesting, I mean, this is just an anecdote, but when Camus learned in 1957 that he had just received the Nobel Prize for Literature, he was so shocked and overwhelmed, and he wanted to avoid the press. So he was having lunch at a brasserie when he heard the news. Rather than returning to his apartment or to his offices at Gallimard, he went to the apartment of the Weils in order to take refuge there. And in fact, the following year, when he went to Stockholm in order to receive the prize and give his speech, he was asked at a press conference who he considered to be his closest friends. And he said, well, there's René Char, the French poet with whom he was extremely close. The other person was Simone Weil. And then a journalist said, but Simone Weil is dead. And Camus' reply was, but that doesn't affect our friendship.
That's incredibly powerful. And so we've got a question from Joanna. I was wondering if Robert Zaretsky has any thoughts on whether there are philosophers living today who live according to the ethics of conviction. Would Peter Singer count? Good question.
And I'm sorry, who was the question? Who asked the question?
Joanna.
Joanna, it's interesting. Joanna, I assume you just read the interview with Peter Singer in the New Yorker magazine, where he confesses he cannot live up to his own precepts, for example, in animal liberation, or his position on euthanasia, not applying it to his own mother, who lived for several years in an assisted living facility. And it's an excellent question. I don't know the answer. And perhaps the reason I don't know it is the reason why most everybody else doesn't know it, because those philosophers don't spend their time writing. And they don't spend their time performing. They simply do. And they probably come closer to the ideals that we find embodied by Simone Weil. But I hope they're wise enough not to try to get too close. Right?
Yeah. And then we've got, I've chosen this one because I like it as well. Matilda has asked, could you tell us about Simone Weil's interaction with Simone de Beauvoir? If I remember correctly, they had quite a frosty relationship.
Frosty is not the word for it. They had just one encounter, and it lasted all of 5 minutes. It was shortly after Simone Weil had entered the École Normale Supérieure, and Beauvoir she was at that time at the Sorbonne, not at the École Normale Supérieure. And she had heard stories about Simone Weil, who was known to her classmates as the categorical imperative in skirts. And of course, all of these stories fascinated Simone Weil, especially Simone de Beauvoir, especially the one where, upon reading an account in a newspaper about a famine in China, Simone Weil broke into tears. And so Beauvoir wanted to meet Weil to see who this person was. And so Beauvoir approached her. They struck up the beginnings of a conversation. And they made reference to the famine in China. And then Beauvoir, and Beauvoir is extremely young at this point. And Beauvoir's reply to Weil was along the lines of, well, I'm not sure the purpose in life is to be happy. Instead, it's to find meaning, as a good philosophy student, I suspect, would say, or a certain kind of philosophy student. And, but for Weil, it's the wrong kind of philosophy student. Weil's reply was a curt, I see you've never gone hungry. And she walked away. And that was, that was more or less the, yeah, that's the relationship. And make of it what you will.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And then we've got a question from Colin. There is a tradition of extreme fasting among medieval female mystics. Do you think Weil was motivated by this when she refused to eat, as well as the solidarity with France?
She might well have been. She was fascinated by Christian mystics, this notion of kenosis, or denying the self, or in a way, annihilating the self in order to make room for God. No doubt that was playing, no doubt, I have no right to say that. I suspect that this played a role in her decision to eat a relative handful of calories every day at the sanatorium. But I can't be certain. There are all sorts of ways of reading her death. But I think that the fascination with how she died in a way leads us away from what's really important. And it's about how she lived, and it's about how she thought. One of the interesting things about Weil, while she was at the hospital dying, and the nurses would encourage her to eat, and she would ask the nurses, how much time each day do you spend thinking? It's a striking question. And I don't know what the nurses made of it. They just wanted their patient to eat. And she's asking them about a very different activity. And, I ask myself that question. And the answer always disappoints me. Right? I really don't spend very much time at all every day thinking. But this is why we read Weil, or this is why I read Weil, because she does remind me how far I fall short day in and day out. And I'd like to think that at times it prods me, if only temporarily, to fall not as short before I do fall back again.
Yeah, no, brilliant, thank you. And so we've got a question from Tonya. You obviously mentioned earlier Simone Weil and Mother Teresa. So she said, in that both Weil and Mother Teresa organized their lives totally according to principle, how are they opposites?
As I mentioned Teresa's name, Mother Teresa's name, I realized that it is perhaps not the best means of contrast with Simone Weil. And I think, I'm sorry, the questioner's name is?
Hillary. Oh, no, not
Hillary's absolutely.
Tonya.
Oh, Tanya. I think Tanya is absolutely right on that score. Rather than citing, say, Mother Teresa, one instance I cite in the book, in part because I'm very familiar with it, because it played a role in Camus' evolution as a thinker, as a practitioner, was the case of Chambon-sur-Lignon, which was a small Protestant village in southeastern France. Now, when Camus found himself living in a farmhouse near this town, in order to cure his own tuberculosis. Like Orwell, like Weil, he too was tubercular. He must have become aware of the activities of the residents of Chambon-sur-Lignon. And after the war, when an American philosopher, they saved the lives of thousands of Jewish refugees, mostly children during the war, at fantastic risk to themselves. After the war, an American moral philosopher by the name of Philip Halley went to Chambon in order to try to understand how, as Halley asks in the subtitle to his book, how did goodness happen here? And what struck him is that nobody could answer the question. And the wife of the pastor, André Trocmé, was the pastor responsible for mobilizing the town on behalf of the Jewish refugees. And his wife, Magda, was asked this question by Halley. And she said, well, you don't think about it. You don't have principles. There was a knock at our door. We opened it. There was somebody in need. Should I have closed the door? That was the question that she then addresses to Halley, okay? And so perhaps the better comparison, Tanya, is not with Mother Teresa, but with individuals like Magda Trocmé or her husband, or the hundreds of villagers in Chambon-sur-Lignon who simply saw human beings in need of help and responded as human beings. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we've got a question from Hilary. Has Simone Weil's thoughts been taken up by liberation theology in the tradition of Guterres, which approaches theology with a preference for the poor? So God's preferential option for the poor. Would you say there's resonance there?
There is a resonance. Again, and I think, Lottie, you're probably far more qualified to answer this question than I am. I mean, you specialize in political theology, and I'm a charlatan. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. I'm simply a historian who stumbles into these amazing lives. And I suspect that she being Simone Weil, would have been aligned with liberation theology. This is certainly how theologians a theologian she was close to saw Christian belief, namely Father Perron, the man with whom she had those conversations in Marseille and then published spiritual autobiography after the war. Perron joined the resistance, right? And he did so like many other Catholics and Protestants in France, who were driven not by political or ideological reasons, but by reasons of faith, their Christian faith. And Father Perron was one of the leading lights of one of the most remarkable underground resistance papers, Les Cahiers de la Témoignage Chrétien, the notebooks of Christian witnessing. For what it's worth, Camus was struck by these individuals too.
You're right.
One of the dogs just knocked over a table with a flower pot.
Oh no.
It's okay. I'll deal with it in a moment.
Okay, it's not
He's okay. He's just in the corner now looking really scared.
Well, thank you. I think we probably got one more question. And Diane has asked, how should we understand the contradiction between Weil's spirituality and her worldliness? I know kind of contradiction is you talk about a lot in the book, the contradiction that she inhabits. And so yeah, the contradiction between her spirituality and her worldliness.
She always lamented the fact that she was privileged. And at times it would drive those who weren't privileged absolutely crazy. For example, when she was teaching at Bourges, I believe in 30 or 31, she managed through one of her students to meet a family by the name of Belleville, a couple who had a farm outside of Bourges, who took her on to help with the chores at the farm. And she would do what she could. She was very awkward and not very good at these chores, but she applied herself to them. But when she wasn't working, she would pepper them with questions about their lives. And when not questioning them, she would, in a way, confide in them that she wished she was poor, that she regretted having been born into privilege. And the Belleville finally asked the parents of the student to disinvite Simone Weil from working at the farm because they were so bothered being told that they were living less than flourishing lives, that they were living unfortunate, not to mention afflicted lives. So there is this extraordinary tension. And it's something that I believe Simone Weil was blind to. Perhaps not blind. I mean, she has to be aware of it because she's always trying to escape this condition into which she's born.